Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. It began with a crack in the foundation. That's what the property records from Montgomery County stated when the Callaway mansion was surveyed in 1859. A simple structural defect, noted plainly in the county assessor's evaluation, decades after the events that would eventually be pieced together by historical researchers. No one questioned why Elizabeth Callaway, a widow of means and social standing, refused entry to surveyors for nearly 9 years, insisting that her home was in perfect condition despite complaints from neighbors about strange odors and unexplained sounds. The mansion stood 3 miles outside of Prattville, Alabama, on a sprawling cotton plantation that had once been the pride of the region. By 1859, it had fallen into visible disrepair, the once manicured grounds overtaken by weeds, the white columns stained with mildew. The crack was discovered only after Elizabeth's death, when her sole surviving relative, a nephew from Boston, arrived to claim his inheritance. What the surveyors found beneath that crack would remain undocumented for almost 100 years. The nephew, Thomas Callaway, ordered all findings sealed, paid substantial sums to local officials, and returned to Boston within a fortnight, never to set foot in Alabama again. The mansion was boarded up, the land sold off in parcels, and the story of Elizabeth Callaway faded into obscurity. Until 1962, when a graduate student from Tuskegee University, researching antebellum architecture, uncovered a series of letters in Thomas Callaway's personal effects, donated to a Massachusetts Historical Society following his death in 1891. The letters spoke of spaces that shouldn't exist, of sounds that had no source, and of a widow who claimed to be guided by a moral purpose that defied the conventions of her time and place. But what truly happened at the Callaway mansion between 1850 and 1858? The historical record offers conflicting accounts, gaps in testimony, and evidence that doesn't align with the accepted narrative of the time. This is the story of what has been called Alabama's forgotten sanctuary, though whether it was sanctuary or prison remains a question that echoes through time. By all accounts, Elizabeth Callaway was born Elizabeth Monroe in 1810 to a prosperous Charleston family with connections throughout the South. Her marriage to plantation owner James Callaway in 1830 was considered advantageous for both families, merging old Southern money with new agricultural wealth. James had inherited his father's cotton plantation outside of Prattville and had expanded the operation to include over 100 enslaved persons by 1840. The Callaways were known in local society as generous hosts, devout Methodists, and by the standards of the time, supposedly humane slaveholders. This reputation would later be called into question by those who knew the truth about what happened after James Callaway's death in the winter of 1849. County records indicate James died of typhoid fever, though rumors persisted that his death came suddenly and under circumstances that raised eyebrows among the plantation-owning class. Elizabeth became the sole proprietor of the Callaway plantation at the age of 39, unusual for a woman in Alabama at that time. More unusual still was her decision to dismiss the white overseer who had managed the plantation's day-to-day operations for nearly 15 years. According to ledgers preserved in the Alabama State Archives, the plantation's production of cotton dropped by nearly 30% in the year following James's death. Though Elizabeth's personal finances showed no signs of strain, it was in the summer of 1850, approximately 6 months after her husband's death, that Elizabeth began the renovations to the mansion that would later become the center of so much speculation. Invoices show substantial purchases of lumber, brick and iron from suppliers as far away as Mobile. The local craftsmen hired to do the work were not from Prattville, but brought in from Montgomery, an unusual choice given the additional expense. More curious still, all workers were dismissed after only 3 weeks, with Elizabeth claiming the renovations were complete, despite the foreman's ledger indicating that only the first phase of work had been finished. What happened in the months that followed has been pieced together from fragments: entries in a household account book kept by Elizabeth, correspondence with merchants in Montgomery and New Orleans, and the recollections of a former house slave named Mercy, recorded by a Works Progress Administration interviewer in 1937, when Mercy would have been over 90 years old. Her testimony, while dismissed by some historians as the foggy recollections of an elderly woman, contains details that align perfectly with physical evidence discovered during a 1965 archaeological survey of the mansion's remains. According to Mercy, in the autumn of 1850, Elizabeth began to change the operation of the plantation in ways that baffled and concerned the neighboring plantation owners. Field hands were reassigned to different tasks without apparent reason. Several skilled enslaved workers, a blacksmith, a carpenter, and a mason, were reported as having run away, their disappearance noted in advertisements placed in the Prattville Progress newspaper, offering rewards for their return. Yet these same individuals were reportedly seen on the property months later by visitors, only to be hurriedly explained away by Elizabeth as new acquisitions with similar skills. The most significant changes, however, occurred within the mansion itself. Elizabeth dismissed all but 5 of her house slaves, sending the rest to work in the fields. She converted the spacious dining room, once the site of lavish dinner parties for Prattville society, into her private study, where she was said to spend hours alone with the door locked. Deliveries arrived at night, carried in through the back entrance by the remaining house slaves under Elizabeth's watchful eye. And then there were the sounds, described by Mercy as like the house itself was breathing underground. Parish records from St. Mark's Episcopal Church note that Elizabeth stopped attending services in November of 1850, citing poor health. Yet merchants in Montgomery reported seeing her regularly, purchasing unusual quantities of medical supplies, preserved foods, and fabric. A ledger from Blackwell's apothecary, preserved in the Montgomery Historical Society's collection, shows Elizabeth purchased enough laudanum, quinine, and bandages over the course of 1851 to supply a small hospital. When questioned by the pharmacist, she allegedly claimed to be sending supplies to cousins in Mississippi who had fallen on hard times. No record of such cousins has ever been found in the extensive genealogical records of the Monroe family. By 1852, rumors had begun to circulate among the plantation-owning families of Autauga County. Elizabeth had withdrawn almost completely from society, declining invitations and receiving few visitors. Those who were admitted to the mansion reported that they were confined to the front parlor, with Elizabeth explaining that the rest of the house was under renovation, or that she had taken ill and wished to limit potential contagion. Several noted that certain doors, which had previously led to other parts of the house, appeared to have been sealed off. When asked directly about these changes, Elizabeth would change the subject or claim that her grief over James's passing had made her seek solitude and simplicity. More concerning to her neighbors was the apparent mismanagement of the plantation. While other cotton operations in the area were expanding to meet growing demand from textile mills in the north and in England, the Callaway plantation's output continued to decrease. Yet there was no evidence that Elizabeth was in financial distress. In fact, bank records from Montgomery show regular transfers of substantial sums into her accounts from sources in Ohio and Pennsylvania, listed vaguely as investment returns. It was in the spring of 1853 that the first documented disappearance connected to the Callaway plantation occurred. A young man named William Henson, who had recently arrived from Virginia to take up a position as a tutor for a neighboring family, vanished after reportedly paying an afternoon call to Elizabeth. His employer, Jonathan Prescott, owner of the adjoining plantation, noted in his journal that Henson had expressed an interest in the history of the region and had mentioned his intention to speak with Elizabeth about local folklore. Henson never returned from this visit, and when Prescott sent inquiries to Elizabeth, she claimed that the young man had stayed only briefly before mentioning plans to travel to Mobile. No trace of William Henson was ever found, despite advertisements placed in newspapers throughout Alabama. This disappearance might have been attributed to the dangers of travel in rural Alabama had it been an isolated incident. But over the next 5 years, according to records compiled by amateur historian Robert Daniels in his 1958 monograph, The Mysteries of Autauga County, at least 7 individuals were reported missing after having some connection to the Callaway plantation. These included an itinerant peddler, a land surveyor working for the county, 2 abolitionists from Philadelphia known to be traveling through the area, and 3 enslaved persons from neighboring plantations who were initially assumed to have run away. In none of these cases was Elizabeth Callaway formally implicated. The disappearances were investigated separately by different authorities and over an extended period. It was only decades later, when the records were examined collectively, that the pattern emerged. Yet contemporary accounts suggest that local suspicion had begun to fall on the widow and her increasingly isolated estate. A letter from Prattville physician, Dr. Samuel Whitfield to his brother in Savannah, dated July 1855, expresses concern about the widow C, who has taken to strange behaviors that call to mind the old tales of women touched by grief to the point of madness. He notes that he was called to the plantation to treat what Elizabeth described as a fever among the house staff, but was permitted to examine only one elderly enslaved man who showed symptoms of malnourishment rather than any identifiable disease. Dr. Whitfield writes that he heard sounds from beyond the locked doors that suggested others in distress, but that his requests to see additional patients were firmly denied by Elizabeth, who stood like a sentinel before the door to the cellar, claiming it unsafe due to recent flooding. This letter represents the first documented mention of unusual activities in the mansion's cellar, a space that would later become the focus of investigators. Original building plans for the Callaway Mansion, filed with the county in 1828, when James's father constructed the home, show a small root cellar typical of homes of that era. Yet the archaeological survey conducted in 1965 revealed a complex of underground rooms extending well beyond the foundation of the house, with evidence of sophisticated construction techniques, including ventilation shafts disguised as ornamental features in the garden. By 1856, Elizabeth's isolation had become nearly complete. Delivery receipts show that supplies were left at the edge of the property, with payment collected by a single enslaved man who refused to engage in conversation beyond the essentials of the transaction. The fields of the plantation lay largely fallow, with only enough cotton harvested to maintain the appearance of a functioning operation. Yet light was seen in the windows of the mansion at all hours, and travelers on the road past the property reported hearing what sounded like singing coming from somewhere on the grounds in the dead of night, not the work songs associated with enslaved field hands, but something described as hymn-like, yet in no language recognized by those who heard it. It was in December of 1856 that the incident occurred, which would eventually lead to the unraveling of whatever Operation Elizabeth Callaway was conducting at her mansion. A severe storm swept through central Alabama, causing the Alabama River and its tributaries to overflow. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Callaway property flooded, water backing up toward the mansion, which sat on a gentle rise. According to an account published in the Prattville Progress at the height of the storm, residents of a small settlement of poor white farmers, located about a mile from the Callaway plantation, reported seeing A procession of figures, some carrying others, moving from the direction of the mansion toward a stand of woods to the north. When asked about this incident by the county sheriff, Elizabeth claimed that some of her field quarters had flooded, and she had directed the enslaved workers to seek shelter in the tobacco drying barn, which stood on higher ground. This explanation was accepted at the time, as the sheriff was preoccupied with flood damage throughout the county. However, land surveys clearly show that the field quarters on the Callaway plantation were located on an elevation similar to the main house and unlikely to have flooded before the mansion itself would have been affected. More revealing is a letter discovered in 1960 among the personal papers of Reverend Josiah Willard, a Northern Methodist minister known for his abolitionist views, who had moved to Cincinnati after serving as a circuit rider in Alabama in the 1840s. The letter, dated February 1857, is from Elizabeth Callaway herself and makes reference to those souls delivered safely to your colleagues despite the unforeseen circumstances of their departure. She goes on to request that future arrangements should include contingency plans for natural disasters, noting that the recent necessity of movement during the storm placed all at risk in ways that might have been avoided with better foresight. This letter strongly suggests that Elizabeth Callaway was involved in the Underground Railroad, the network of secret routes and safe houses used by enslaved African Americans to escape to free states and Canada. This would explain many of the irregularities in the operation of the plantation, the decrease in cotton production as enslaved workers were being secreted north rather than working the fields, the renovations to create hidden spaces, the supplies of medicine and food, the financial transfers from northern states, even the disappearances if those individuals had either joined the escape network or, perhaps more darkly, discovered it and been silenced. Yet the physical evidence discovered beneath the mansion in 1965, along with certain entries in Elizabeth's personal journal recovered from her nephew's effects, paint a more complex and disturbing picture than that of a simple way station on the road to freedom. The archaeological survey, conducted by a team from Auburn University, revealed that the spaces beneath the Callaway mansion had been extensively modified to create what appeared to be living quarters. But these were not merely temporary hiding places for people on their way north. The rooms, which extended in a labyrinthine fashion beyond the house's foundation, showed evidence of long-term occupation. Personal effects found in the spaces included handmade toys, clothing that had been repeatedly mended, and makeshift furniture fashioned from scrap lumber. Most tellingly, the walls of several rooms were covered with marks, tallies that appeared to count days, weeks, perhaps even months or years. Elizabeth's journal, which covers the period from January 1850 to November 1857, begins as a conventional record of a plantation mistress's daily concerns, but gradually transforms into something more troubling. Early entries show her grief over James's death, but by late 1850, her writing focuses obsessively on what she calls my true calling and the souls in my keeping. She writes of hearing voices guiding her actions, of visions in which the walls of the mansion part to reveal chambers of sanctuary. Her religious language intensifies, with repeated references to herself as an instrument of divine purpose, and to the spaces beneath her home as the ark of salvation in a flood of wickedness. Most disturbing are entries from 1854 and 1855 in which Elizabeth records making difficult decisions for the greater good. She writes of individuals who could not be trusted with knowledge of the sanctuary and who now reside where they can cause no harm. These cryptic statements coincide with the disappearances documented by Robert Daniels, suggesting that Elizabeth may have been responsible for the fate of those missing persons. The journal also reveals that Elizabeth was suffering from what modern psychiatrists would likely diagnose as a severe mental illness, possibly exacerbated by her isolation and the stress of her secret activities. She describes conversations with her dead husband, whose spirit, she claimed, advised her on expanding the underground chambers. She records periods of sleeplessness lasting days, followed by vivid hallucinations. By 1856, her handwriting becomes increasingly erratic, and she begins to express paranoia about agents of evil seeking to discover her holy work. The most revealing and most troubling aspect of the journal emerges in entries from early 1857, after the flood incident. Elizabeth writes of conflict with those I have sheltered who now lack gratitude for their salvation. She describes implementing necessary disciplines and confinement for the protection of the unruly. One entry states, "They do not understand that freedom without preparation is a curse, not a blessing. They must remain under my guidance until their souls are ready for the journey, no matter how their bodies protest." These passages suggest that what began as participation in the Underground Railroad may have transformed, under the influence of Elizabeth's deteriorating mental state, into something very different. Rather than helping enslaved people escape to freedom, she appears to have been keeping them confined in the spaces beneath her mansion, convinced that she alone knew what was best for them. This interpretation is supported by the testimony of Mercy, the former house slave interviewed in 1937. According to Mercy, Elizabeth would descend into the underground rooms each evening to preach to her congregation, bringing food and medicine, but also punishment for those who questioned her wisdom. Mercy claimed that those who were initially brought to the mansion with promises of passage north would eventually realize that no one ever left the mistress's protection, for she feared the world would corrupt them. The fate of those confined beneath the Callaway mansion became clearer in the summer of 1858, when a prolonged drought struck central Alabama. Though her account was initially discounted due to her advanced age, the physical evidence later discovered aligns with her description of the mistress's collection of souls kept beneath the house. Wells throughout the region ran dry, and water sources became precious. According to records from neighboring plantations, Elizabeth began to make unprecedented requests for water to be delivered to her property, offering exorbitant prices. When these requests were questioned, she claimed that her own well had collapsed and that she needed the water for household use and for the few remaining field hands. It was during this period that local suspicions about the widow reached their peak. Jonathan Prescott, the neighboring plantation owner who had employed the missing tutor William Henson, noted in his journal that smoke could be seen rising from the Callaway mansion at odd hours, yet Elizabeth had dismissed her cook months earlier. He also recorded hearing sounds of distress, like many voices calling out at once, coming from the direction of the mansion on still nights. The turning point came in August of 1858, when a fire broke out in one of the outbuildings on the Callaway property. The blaze, visible from Prattville, prompted several townspeople to ride out to offer assistance. Elizabeth initially refused their entry onto the grounds, standing at the gate with a shotgun and claiming she could manage the situation with her own people. It was only when the fire threatened to spread to the fields of the adjacent Prescott plantation that the sheriff was summoned and forced entry onto the property. While the men fought to contain the fire, which had begun to spread to a storage barn near the main house, two of them reported hearing cries for help coming from somewhere near the mansion. Breaking away from the firefighting effort, they approached the house and found a portion of the ground behind the kitchen had collapsed, revealing what appeared to be a tunnel entrance. From this opening came the sounds of multiple people calling for assistance. What happened next is documented in the sheriff's report, filed in Autauga County records on August 23, 1858. The men entered the tunnel and discovered a series of underground rooms in which they found, according to the carefully worded official account, 12 individuals of African descent in various states of distress, some showing signs of prolonged confinement. The sheriff's report does not detail the conditions of these individuals beyond noting that they required medical attention and that the spaces in which they were found were unsuitable for human habitation, lacking adequate ventilation and sanitation. More revealing is a private letter written by one of the men who entered the tunnels, preserved in the collection of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. In this account, he describes rooms barely high enough for a man to stand upright, with air so thick with the stench of human waste and sickness that we could scarcely breathe. He writes of finding people chained to the walls in several chambers, others free to move within their confined spaces but with no means of exit, and several who were too weak from illness or malnourishment to stand without assistance. Most disturbing, he notes finding the remains of what appeared to be at least 3 individuals who had been deceased for some time, their bodies positioned in a manner suggesting they had been the subject of some strange vigil or ceremony. When confronted with these discoveries, Elizabeth Calloway reportedly showed no remorse or concern for the welfare of those found beneath her home. According to multiple accounts, she proclaimed that she had been charged by God with the protection of these souls from the corruption of the world, and that those who had died had simply completed their earthly trials and moved on to divine reward. She insisted that her actions were motivated by Christian charity, claiming that she had rescued these individuals from far worse conditions with the intention of eventually releasing them to freedom when they had been properly prepared through prayer and instruction. The immediate aftermath of these discoveries was managed with an emphasis on discretion. The surviving individuals found beneath the mansion were quietly distributed among several plantations in the county. There is no record of any of them ever achieving freedom. They simply disappear from historical documentation, their fates unknown. Elizabeth Calloway was not publicly charged with any crime, a fact that speaks to the complex legal and social attitudes toward both slavery and mental illness in antebellum Alabama. Instead, according to correspondence between the sheriff and Elizabeth's nephew in Boston, Thomas Calloway, it was agreed that Elizabeth would be committed to the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane in Tuscaloosa. Hospital admission records confirm that she was received as a patient on September 3, 1858, with a diagnosis of religious monomania and derangement of the moral faculties. The admitting physician noted that she arrived in a state of extreme agitation, claiming that agents of Satan had interfered with her divine mission. Elizabeth Calloway remained institutionalized until her death in January of 1859, just 4 months after her admission. The hospital's death register lists the cause as brain fever, though modern medical historians suggest this could have been any number of conditions, from meningitis to stroke to the physical effects of severe mental breakdown. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the hospital grounds, as was common practice for patients whose families did not claim their remains. Thomas Calloway arrived in Prattville in February to settle his aunt's estate. According to local accounts, he stayed at the Prescott plantation rather than at the Calloway mansion, which he visited only once, accompanied by the sheriff and several workmen. After this visit, he gave instructions for the mansion to be securely boarded up and for the entrances to the underground spaces to be sealed with brick and mortar. He sold the land parcel by parcel to neighboring plantation owners at prices well below market value, on the condition that the mansion itself would remain untouched and unoccupied. What Thomas discovered during his single visit to the mansion remains unknown. No written account of his impressions survives, and he never spoke publicly about his aunt or her activities. The only hint comes from a letter he wrote to his wife in Boston, in which he states simply, "The family name has been stained by associations I dare not commit to paper. I have done what I can to ensure that the evil ends here. Some secrets are best left buried, and I pray that what lies beneath the Calloway land remains undisturbed for all time." The Callaway mansion stood abandoned for decades, gradually succumbing to the elements and the encroachment of nature. By the time of the Civil War, it was already described as a crumbling monument to forgotten sins. Local residents avoided the property, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered beneath its foundations. Parents warned children to stay away from the old Callaway place, though few could articulate exactly what had happened there, as the story had been deliberately obscured by those who knew the truth. It was not until the civil rights movement of the 1960s brought renewed attention to the history of slavery and resistance that scholars began to piece together the story of Elizabeth Callaway and her underground chambers. The Archaeological Survey of 1965, conducted as part of a broader study of sites associated with the Underground Railroad, revealed the physical evidence that confirmed many elements of the oral history that had been preserved primarily among the African American communities of Autauga County. Yet even now, the full truth of what occurred at the Callaway Mansion between 1850 and 1858 remains elusive. Was Elizabeth Callaway a mentally ill woman whose initial good intentions to help enslaved people escape to freedom devolved into a god complex that led her to imprisonment and even murder? Or was she, from the beginning, a sadistic individual who used the guise of abolitionism to satisfy darker urges? The historical record offers no definitive answers. What is clear is that beneath the floorboards of a mansion in Alabama, a woman created a space that defied the moral conventions of her time, not by helping to free the enslaved, as she may have initially intended, but by establishing her own private realm where she wielded absolute power over those she claimed to be saving. In doing so, she created a nightmare more subtle but no less horrific than the institutionalized evil of the slavery system itself. The land where the Callaway Mansion once stood is now part of a nature preserve outside of Prattville. Few visitors to the area know the history of the property or would guess, looking at the peaceful grove of oak trees that has grown up over the former foundation, that such darkness once thrived there. Yet local historians report that metal detectorists and amateur archaeologists occasionally discover artifacts in the surrounding fields, buttons, coins, and small personal items that may have belonged to those who passed through Elizabeth Callaway's sanctuary. Perhaps most haunting of all is a discovery made during a drought in 1954, when the creek that runs along what was once the eastern edge of the Callaway property dried up completely. In the exposed creek bed, a local fisherman found a small tin box containing a handwritten note. The paper was largely deteriorated, but conservation efforts managed to preserve a portion of the text. If these words are found, know that we lived. We were 15 souls beneath the widow's floor. We called for help each night. Remember us. The note was unsigned, and efforts to date the paper or identify the handwriting have been inconclusive. Today, the story of Elizabeth Callaway and her underground chambers exists in that shadowy realm between documented history and regional folklore. Some scholars dismiss the more lurid elements as exaggerations born of the human tendency to create monsters out of the unknown. Others argue that the physical evidence, combined with the written records that do survive, paint a picture of human cruelty that requires no embellishment to horrify. What remains undeniable is that in the years leading up to the Civil War, in a mansion outside Prattville, Alabama, something occurred that was so disturbing that an entire community conspired to erase it from public memory. The widow who claimed divine guidance created a hidden world beneath her home, and those who entered that world found themselves caught in a distorted vision of salvation that for many became a prison from which the only escape was death. The cracks in the foundation, noted so prosaically in the county records of 1859, concealed a far deeper fracture in the human soul, a darkness that echoes still for those who know where to listen for its whispers. The land has been built over, the mansion long since returned to dust, but some say that on still summer nights, when the moon is new and darkness blankets the former Calloway property, the sound of voices can be heard, not crying out in pain or fear, but singing hymns in languages no local resident recognizes. Whether these are the voices of the dead seeking acknowledgement of their suffering, or simply the wind moving through the hollow spaces that still exist beneath the ground, only those who hear them can decide. The story of the widow Calloway and her underground sanctuary remains one of Alabama's most disturbing historical footnotes, a reminder that evil often wears the face of benevolence, and that the road to hell is indeed paved with intentions that may once have been good. In the complex moral landscape of pre-Civil War America, Elizabeth Calloway created her own twisted moral universe, one in which salvation and imprisonment became indistinguishable, and freedom remained forever just beyond reach. Some of the most compelling evidence about Elizabeth Calloway's sanctuary comes from a collection of artifacts discovered during the 1965 archaeological survey. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Elizabeth's private study, researchers found a tin box containing several items that offer glimpses into the mind of the widow and the experiences of those kept beneath her home. Among these items was a small leather-bound journal not belonging to Elizabeth, but to a woman identified only as M. Historians believe this may have been written by a woman named Miriam, listed in Calloway plantation records as a house slave purchased in 1845. The journal, consisting of just 12 pages, appears to have been written during confinement in the underground chambers. The handwriting is uneven, suggesting it was written in poor light or by someone in physical distress. Most entries are undated, but references to seasonal changes indicate the journal spans at least 1 full year. One passage reads, "The mistress comes at night with scripture on her tongue and shadows in her eyes. She speaks of salvation while the chains around my ankles grow tighter. 3 more arrived yesterday, brought down blindfolded and weeping. She tells them this is the pathway to freedom, but there is no path here, only rooms that lead to other rooms, and all of them locked from the outside." Another entry describes the physical space. "We hear the house above us, the footsteps like thunder over our heads. The air moves through small pipes in the walls, her design," she says proudly, "to keep us breathing. But the air is never enough, never fresh, always heavy with our fears and sickness. Some chambers are connected by crawl spaces so narrow that only the children can move between them. They become our messengers, our only way of knowing who else suffers here besides ourselves." Most disturbing is an entry that appears to be among the last written. "Nathaniel died in the night, the 3rd this month. His body remains with us, as the others did, until the smell becomes too much for even the mistress to bear when she makes her rounds." She says their souls have graduated from her earthly school. She speaks of them with pride, as if their deaths fulfill her purpose rather than condemn it. "I have hidden this journal in the hope that someday someone will know we existed. If you read these words, remember that we had names, dreams, families. Remember that we were here." Also in the tin box was a hand-drawn map of the underground spaces, labeled in what appears to be Elizabeth's handwriting. The chambers are given biblical names: Gethsemane, Jericho, Eden, Golgotha, and notations indicate which rooms were used for which purposes. Some are marked as instruction or reflection, while others bear more ominous labels such as correction and purification. The most troubling is a small chamber marked simply as transition, which archaeological evidence suggests was where those who died in captivity were kept before burial. A third item from the box offers perhaps the most chilling insight into Elizabeth's distorted worldview. It is a carefully hand-copied excerpt from a sermon with no attribution, but likely from a text that Elizabeth brought with her into her isolation. The passage, underlined heavily in several places, reads, True mercy sometimes requires confinement of the body to allow salvation of the soul. As a parent restricts a child's movement to prevent harm, so must the shepherd sometimes pen the flock for protection from wolves they are too innocent to fear. The highest form of love is that which denies immediate comfort for eternal salvation. In the margins, Elizabeth had written, "My justification. They will understand in heaven what they resist on earth." The archaeological survey also revealed evidence of how the underground complex functioned as a self-contained environment. Ventilation shafts, disguised as garden ornaments, provided minimal air circulation. A sophisticated drainage system channeled waste away from the living spaces, though its capacity was clearly inadequate for the number of people confined there. Most ingenious and disturbing was a network of speaking tubes that allowed Elizabeth to communicate from her private study to each underground chamber individually, enabling her to monitor and address her captives without having to descend among them, except when she chose to. The question that has troubled historians for decades is how Elizabeth Callaway, a woman with no architectural training, could have designed and implemented such an elaborate structure. The answer may lie in the disappearances documented during the early years of her widowhood. The surveyor, the mason, and the carpenter who were reported missing may have been coerced into applying their skills to create the underground complex before becoming its first permanent residence. This theory is supported by markings found on the interior walls of the chambers during the archaeological survey. In one room, partially obscured by later chalk marks, researchers found an inscription that read, "Martin Coopersmith, Mason, Charleston, began work September 12, 1850. Imprisonment commenced November 23. No historical record of a Mason by that name has been found in Charleston records, though a Martin Coopersmith is mentioned in a Charleston Mercury newspaper advertisement from 1849 offering skilled masonry services for distinguished homes. The complex beneath the Callaway mansion represents one of the most perverse ironies of the pre-Civil War South. A structure built ostensibly to liberate enslaved people that instead became a different kind of bondage, one justified not by economic interest or racial theory, but by a distorted religious vision that was perhaps more terrifying for being born of what may have initially been genuine humanitarian concern. The transformation of Elizabeth Callaway from grieving widow to messianic captor did not occur in a vacuum. Historical context suggests several factors that may have contributed to her psychological deterioration. The death of her husband removed the social constraints that had governed her behavior as a plantation mistress. The isolation of her rural Alabama estate allowed her actions to go unscrutinized. And the extreme moral contradictions of antebellum Southern society, a culture that prided itself on Christian virtue while maintaining a system of human bondage, provided fertile ground for the development of her particular delusion, that true freedom could only be achieved through a period of purification under her personal spiritual guidance. Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a historian and psychologist who has studied the Callaway case extensively, suggests in her 1983 analysis that Elizabeth may have been suffering from what modern psychiatry would diagnose as bipolar disorder with psychotic features, exacerbated by the trauma of her husband's death and the moral conflict she experienced as a slaveholder with growing abolitionist sympathies. The evidence suggests that Elizabeth Callaway began with genuine intentions to assist enslaved people in escaping north, writes Dr. Whitman. The correspondence with known abolitionists in Ohio and Pennsylvania supports this interpretation. However, as her mental state deteriorated, her messianic delusions transformed what might have been a station on the Underground Railroad into something far more sinister. A private fiefdom where she could play savior to captives who had no choice but to endure her increasingly erratic behavior. This interpretation is supported by the evolution of Elizabeth's journal entries over time. Early writings show her struggling with the moral implications of slaveholding following her husband's death. An entry from March 1850 reads, "I have prayed for guidance regarding the souls in my care. James believed their servitude was ordained by God, but I find myself unable to reconcile the teachings of Christ with the cries I hear from the quarters at night. There must be another path." By June of that same year, her language shifts subtly. "I have received my calling. The Lord has shown me that I am to be the vessel through which salvation will flow. The path to freedom must begin with spiritual liberation, and I alone have been chosen to provide this guidance." This entry coincides with the beginning of the renovations to the mansion, suggesting that the physical transformation of the house paralleled the psychological transformation of its mistress. By 1852, her writings show clear evidence of delusional thinking. "They resist my teaching, ungrateful for the sacrifice I make in sheltering them from the corruption of the world. They do not understand that what they perceive as confinement is in fact the cocoon from which their souls will emerge transformed. I must be firm, even when their ingratitude wounds me deeply." This is the burden of the chosen. What makes the Calloway case so disturbing is not just the suffering inflicted upon those imprisoned beneath her home, but the way it illuminates the thin line between beneficence and tyranny, between rescue and captivity. Elizabeth Calloway appears to have believed, to her last day, that she was performing an act of Christian charity. The road to her private hell was indeed paved with intentions that may initially have been good. The response of the community to the discoveries at the Calloway mansion also reveals much about the social dynamics of pre-Civil War Alabama. The decision to handle the matter quietly, committing Elizabeth to an asylum rather than prosecuting her for kidnapping or murder, redistributing her captives to other plantations rather than granting them the freedom she had originally promised, speaks to the overriding concern of the plantation-owning class, maintaining the system of slavery at all costs. Jonathan Prescott, the neighboring plantation owner whose journal provides much of the contemporary account of these events, wrote in October 1858, "The affair at the Seed Place has been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. The unfortunate lady's condition made any public accounting of events unnecessary and indeed undesirable. The peculiar nature of her delusion, that she was providing a kind of liberation, might plant dangerous ideas if widely discussed. Better that the entire matter be consigned to oblivion." This conspiracy of silence was largely successful. For almost a century, the story of Elizabeth Calloway and her underground sanctuary was preserved primarily through oral tradition in the African American communities of central Alabama, dismissed by white historians as folklore until the physical evidence uncovered in the 1960s made denial no longer possible. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of the Calloway story is the fate of those who survived their imprisonment beneath the mansion. Historical records indicate that after their discovery, 12 individuals, 7 women, 3 men and 2 children, were distributed among neighboring plantations. Their names appear in property records: Mercy, Nathaniel, Sarah, Eliza, William, Joseph, Harriet, Rebecca, Samuel, Grace and 2 children, identified only as girl approx 7 years and boy approx 10 years. Of these 12, only Mercy can be traced with any certainty through subsequent historical documents. She appears in the 1860 census as the property of the Prescott plantation, listed as female, black, approximately 45 years. After emancipation, she is recorded in the 1870 census as Mercy Williams, 55, domestic servant, still residing in Autauga County. It was this same Mercy who provided the WPA interview in 1937, one of the earliest first-hand accounts of life beneath the Calloway mansion. In that interview, conducted when she would have been well over 90 years old, Mercy offers a perspective that complicates the historical narrative. When asked about Elizabeth Calloway, she's quoted as saying, "Miss Elizabeth started out wanting to do good. That's what makes it all so terrible. She would read to us from the Bible and tell us about the free states up north where black folks could live without masters. Some did get sent north in the beginning. We would help prepare them, get them ready for the journey, teach them what they needed to know to survive. But then something changed in her. Her eyes got a strange light. She started seeing visions, talking about angels giving her instructions. That's when the doors got locked. That's when the help became a prison." This nuanced view, acknowledging Elizabeth's initial good intentions while condemning the horror that followed, offers perhaps the most balanced assessment of the Calloway case. It suggests a tragedy with no true villains, only victims, including, in some sense, Elizabeth herself, a woman whose moral awakening became corrupted by mental illness and the poisonous social environment of the slave-holding South. The Calloway case stands as a dark chapter in Alabama's history, but also as a cautionary tale about the dangers of messianic thinking and the way that power, even when initially wielded with benevolent intent, can corrupt absolutely. Elizabeth Calloway began by questioning the morality of slavery and ended by creating her own private system of bondage, justified by a personal theology that placed her in the role of savior. The story also highlights the complex moral landscape of the pre-Civil War South, where even apparent acts of resistance against the institution of slavery could become warped by the very logic of ownership and control that underpinned that institution. Elizabeth rejected the economic justification for slavery only to embrace a spiritual one, exchanging one form of bondage for another, while maintaining her position of absolute authority. As for the Calloway mansion itself, nature has long since reclaimed the site. The last remaining wall collapsed during a storm in 1943, and today only the stone foundation and a few scattered bricks mark where the house once stood. The entrances to the underground chambers, so carefully sealed by Thomas Calloway in 1859, have never been reopened, though ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 1998 confirmed that the spaces still exist, now partially flooded and inaccessible. Local attitudes toward the site have evolved over time. Once avoided as a place of ill omen, the former Calloway property is now marked by a small plaque acknowledging its historical significance, though the text makes only vague reference to activities associated with the Underground Railroad. Plans for a more detailed historical marker that would tell the full story of Elizabeth Calloway and her captives have been proposed but remain controversial, with some local historians arguing that the site should be preserved as a reminder of a dark chapter in Alabama's past, while others contend that the memory of Elizabeth's victims would be better honored by allowing their place of suffering to fade from the landscape. What cannot be erased, however, is the impact of their story on our understanding of history. The Calloway case reminds us that the moral choices of the past were rarely as clear-cut as they may appear in retrospect, that human motivations are complex and often contradictory, and that the capacity for both great compassion and terrible cruelty can exist within the same heart. For those who study the history of the Underground Railroad and resistance to slavery, the Calloway Mansion represents a dark counterpoint to narratives of heroic abolitionists and daring escapes. It serves as a reminder that not all who claimed to offer sanctuary did so without extracting a terrible price of their own. In the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to those who suffered beneath the Calloway Mansion is not a physical marker, but the commitment to remember their story, to acknowledge that behind the sanitized narratives of history lie complex human experiences of hope, betrayal, resistance, and endurance. The voices that sang hymns in the darkness beneath an Alabama plantation house may now be silent, but their echo remains for those willing to listen to the uncomfortable truths they have to teach us about our shared past. As the sun sets over what was once the Callaway plantation, casting long shadows across the overgrown foundation stones, one might imagine those underground chambers still populated by the spirits of those who lived and died there, not as supernatural entities, but as the persistence of memory in a landscape that has witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature. Their story, nearly lost to history, now stands as testament to the enduring human capacity for survival even in the darkest of circumstances, and as a warning about how easily the desire to do good can become corrupted when it is married to absolute power. The final known reference to Elizabeth Callaway comes from an attendant at the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane, who recorded in his personal diary in January 1859, "The widow passed today, still clutching the small Bible she would not relinquish even in her most violent episodes. She takes her true intentions to the grave, leaving behind only questions that echo through the chambers she created. Chambers that, like her distorted vision of salvation, offered the false promise of light while delivering only deeper darkness. Those chambers beneath the Callaway mansion, now silent and sealed away from human access, remain a physical embodiment of one of history's most disturbing ironies. A place created in the name of freedom that became one of the most complete expressions of captivity, a sanctuary that was also a prison conceived in compassion but executed in cruelty, a shadow reflection of the larger moral contradiction that was the antebellum South itself. Her last words, spoken clearly after days of incoherence, were, "They are waiting for me below." Whether this represented a final moment of lucidity and remorse, or simply another manifestation of her delusion, none can say. And so the story of the widow who hid slaves beneath her mansion takes its place among the complex narratives of American history, neither a simple tale of heroism nor of villainy, but a reminder of how thin the line can be between salvation and suffering, and how easily human beings can convince themselves that cruelty is kindness when they believe themselves divinely appointed to determine the fate of others. The land where the Callaway mansion once stood continues its slow return to wilderness, the physical traces of human habitation gradually disappearing beneath creeping vines and falling leaves. But the story remains, passed from generation to generation, a whispered warning about the dangers of righteousness untempered by humility and of the darkest depths to which the human spirit can descend even when following what it believes to be the light of divine guidance. For in the final analysis, the true horror of the Callaway case lies not in the physical conditions of the underground chambers, nor even in the suffering of those confined within them, but in the revelation that evil often wears the face of benevolence, and that hell can be created by those who believe themselves to be building heaven on earth. That is the legacy of the widow's sanctuary, a cautionary tale that continues to haunt the collective conscience of a nation still struggling to reconcile its highest ideals with its darkest chapters. In the words attributed to Mercy Williams in her WPA interview, "Miss Elizabeth taught me something I never forgot. She taught me that when somebody claims they're saving you, first thing you should ask is, saving you from what, and saving you for whom? Because sometimes the rescue is just another kind of cage, with bars you can't even see until it's too late." A lesson paid for in suffering, passed down through time. The final, unintended gift of the widow who created a sanctuary that was also a prison beneath the floorboards of a mansion in Alabama.